Can you hear me? I'm looking at my notebook, how to share my screen. Good afternoon and good morning. It is my pleasure to share with you about the Duanbing modern sports reflection in China, as well as some of my personal thoughts. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm still looking for the button how to share my screen. Okay, here it is. It seems that I can't share it with you. Now it's coming out. Yes. Okay. Now let me start. This is what I'm going to talk about. The title is Duanbing, a modern sport reflection of a traditional Chinese sword games. Duanbing, literally in Chinese, Duanbing means close body combat, with or without weapons. So I'm going to cover 3 items in my agenda. First of all, the history of combat of Duanbing. Secondly, the evolution, and finally, about my organization, what we have done in the past 20 years in terms of Duanbing. As we all know that this is a 2-day conference, and we have been talking about something very important, a very important theme, which is the sword culture, as well as people's appreciation of such sword culture in China. So what is the culture, how the weapons are preserved? So this is still a very important part in the Chinese sword culture. For martial art in China, I believe that this is part of the core concept. As for Duanbing, or close body combating or fencing, so far in China, it has been serving as a very important part in sword play. Even in the ancient time, it was an important part. For the sword play, this game doesn't have a very long history, about 100 years, I think. In the 20th last century, after great changes in China, from the Middle Ages period to the modern period in China, a lot of changes happened in China, in our culture. Therefore, people began to reflect what we had got in our traditional culture and what we need to change. For example, sanshou. Sanshou is a Chinese-styled wrestling and boxing. Changbing literally means the long weapon-based combat, as well as arrow shooting. So those were regarded as one national martial arts. Why the Duanbing and swords are so closely related to each other? Chinese people really love swords. And for a Chinese person, so there are a limited number of symbols that can really stand for the ancient society or ancient civilization. For example, jade. Jade stands for purity. It stands for virtue and spirituality. The other symbol can be a sword. For example, Sima Qian, a great historian, once wrote in his book about a sword, as well as a Chinese preference on culture. He said, when a person is faithful, creditable, courageous, and benevolence, can have the capability of holding a sword. That is to say, having a sword in your hand, you can govern yourself internally. You can also defend yourself from the externals. So as we stand, that people talk about Tao a lot in the ancient time, And the sword is something that can be equivalent to the Taoism at that time. In this way, you may understand how important sword was to the ancient Chinese culture. In the ancient times, even though swords were popular and there was a sword civilization at that time, there were a lot of different types of weapons and a lot of different types of combats as well. The sword-based combat is called xiangji. A lot of poems, a lot of literatures wrote about such combats as a sword-based combats, just like fencing. It's also a type of sword play at that time. And people appreciated those performances. 愿语录剑 is one of the literatures. For example, the two persons, they fought together, they just played together with swords. And 荆轲刺秦王 is another one. 荆轲tried to stab the emperor with his sword. Actually, it's a dagger hidden in his rolling map. So from Zhou, Qin, and then Sui and the Tang dynasties. It's very interesting history in China. If you look at our ancient civilization, we are different from any other countries in the world. So we have super stability in China, even though there were generations after generations, dynasties after generations. However, our culture has been stable. There haven't been major changes in Chinese culture. And one example is the changes to the weapons, to all those devices and pieces. From the bronze area to the iron area, you can see the functionalities may change, but overall, its symbols didn't change. It stands for virtue, it stands for social status, and such functions were kept. After the Chunqiu periods, having a sword with you shows that you are at a higher level in the society. And even there are evaluators who could assess the value of a sword. For such occupations were not often seen in other countries. So at that time, they became the swordsman. So swordsmen, they are the private swords. They own their swords, they have their skills, and they serve others as swordsmen, just like those heroes in the martial art histories. So these group of people, they still existed after Han and the Tang dynasty, even though swords became less and less popular in the battlefields after the Han dynasty. However, people still spoke highly on swords. All this shows that along with the changes in China's history, particularly after the Dong Han, East Han, West Han, and Sui and Tang, along with the changes in China's dynasties, the status of sword began to fall because people began to use more and more iron, and knives became more popular than swords. And because knife, you have just one cutting edge, but swords have double edges. However, at that time, when people talk about knife is still not as superior as a sword. So we have a book, 古今刀剑录. This book began to appear in Nan Dynasty, where there were a lot of descriptions on swords instead of knives. Even though the title of the book is called A History of Knives and Swords in China. However, what the book talks about is mainly about swords instead of knives. So when people talk about knives and swords now, actually people not talk about knives that much, but rather people focus more on swords. For the interest of time, I will be brief in the following slides. Now we are talking about the swords technology and the remaking of a swords of the ancient time. Actually, we are talking about sports. We're talking about swords play. What I talked about just now was about an ancient time before the Sui dynasty and the Tang dynasty. From the Song, Yuan, and the Qing dynasties, the way people talk about, people use the swords and the way people made swords, we don't know much about that. And we understand that some major technologies were originated from the Ming and the Qing dynasties. Even though if you have any collections here, I noticed that we have some experts, some collectors here in the meeting. Or if you go to any museum to look at the swords, you may find that the forging technologies made it clear that a sword is used for single-handed only. From the Bronze era to the Iron era, either knife or sword, it is single-hand based weapon. The other hand, maybe in your other hand, you held something else, for example, a shelf, a shelter or something like that. Or in the 水浒传, for example, Wu Song held his knife with two hands. But no matter how, in the ancient time, the swords were made for single handing only. I listened to Mr. Gong Jian in his presentation. What he said is very important. Many people asked me, when we watched TV or when we watched go to a theater, there are a lot of fighting scenes, combating scenes. But in the ancient time, we used swords a lot. And you may find that, number one, the guards. We didn't have a lot of guards or very big guards for self-protection. Second, our swords are very thin. The blades are thinner than the knives or blades from other countries. Now, maybe because of our military history, as well as our metallurgy level at that time. So all the swords were made in that way in the ancient time. So Chinese people are not that, so physically not that powerful enough. In the combating history in China, people used to win over your enemy by using a wisdom, not using a weapon. So when you focus a lot on your physical strength, then you have to think about how to avoid being attacked while think about attacking others. That is defense first instead of offending first. In some minority nationalities or some other countries, the soldiers had to wear very heavy armor and they offend a lot instead of defending a lot. So, but the way Chinese fought a fight is that they had to think about the defend. In our literature about martial art, it is even clearer now because flexibility is changeable, agility instead of face-to-face fight. So I think this is an example of usage of wisdom in the ancient time. It's a result of our mentality as well as physical wisdom. Based on this, there came the fencing or sword play. So these pictures were taken in the recent China. Some pictures were from the books. And you can see all the swords that were held single-handedly. Nowadays, it is very popular that people use the Japanese sword as a very important example of a Chinese sword history. A lot of Chinese martial arts fans or foreign martial arts fans love to learn how to play a Japanese sword or this type of Miao sword. So if you look at history, actually, it is not the right example. When you hold a hand or the double-handed sword among the ordinary people or in the literature, there were some examples, but not popular. So most of the cases, people still held their swords with single hand. I believe that the reason is very simple. The fighting pattern is different. It's a strategic thinking. So flexibility is a major concern. Secondly, the weight of a sword. So at that time, all the swords, they were not that heavy, not very big. So that's why the most popular swords, they are slender and they were light. And I think the Japanese sword is because of the influence of a Japanese culture. And people didn't know much about the Japanese swords versus the Chinese swords. So we can still see some Japanese swords, some main swords, so on and so forth. They're different styled swords. Their making were different. Their forging technologies were close to the Japanese swords. However, in terms of usage, usually people still hold it with a single hand. It's not a double hand holding one, particularly for the soldiers. A soldier never holds a sword with two hands. The reason why the Japanese styled sword holding is popular is because our martial art involvement is behind and they appreciated foreign things, particularly the Japanese styled sword holding. Now, culturally, we must be more confident. We have to rejuvenate our own sword culture. So that's why we have to promote more the Chinese way of sword holding, the single hand sword holding. As I said, this Duanbing or the fencing or sword play came into existence in the 20th last century. Zhao Zhijiang, as well as an educator, Cai Yuanpei, they promoted this program together, which is called the National Martial Arts, including music, sports, so on and so forth, the national arts. Martial arts is part of the program. They prioritized all those national arts and work out promotion programs. So Duanbing or fencing or sword play was included as a type of martial arts. When Duanbing came into place, it was influenced by the sword play in Japan. The earliest training record is a textbook on fencing in 20th last century. People using fencing or sword play instead of Duanbing. People didn't use that word yet, even though people call it in different ways. However, people began to appreciate the sword play. In 20th last century, you can see this is the book, textbook, and there are some other publications as well. So all the single-held swords. And as for the protective devices, they were similar like the ones in Japan. And you can, if you look at the picture here, and all the protections were in Japanese style. This is a Duanbing competition, the first national exam in the 20th last century. And you can see all the armor, the helmet, they were all in Japanese style. So before the competition, they made their protections by themselves. My great-grandfather worked in the central library and he was involved into the competition. He was one of the members to prepare the protections. At that time, for the sword, people could hold the sword with two hands. But in our Duanbing course nowadays in university, people still think that it is okay, it is acceptable to hold a hand either by hold a sword either by single hand or by double hands, or even change over between hands. It's only that single hand is the mainstream way of holding a sword. This is my great-grandfather, and these are the pictures during the competition. In addition to him, there are some other people, such as famous educators Lianzhen and Zhuge Fu and so forth. They worked together to promote Duanbing at that time. So the short Japanese sword, and they also prepared some other swords made of wood, made of other materials. So this picture was taken in the 30s, last century. And these two persons, they were college graduates. It's the fencing and the sword play for inspection. So it's just like the name martial art or wushu, how this name evolved. The name of Duanbing also evolved one step by step. So in the 20s and the 30s, last century, there wasn't such a name. We talk about the national arts. When we talk about the martial arts, it is a combination of a different kung fu, boxing, and the swords, and so on and so forth. And Duanbing was invented later, and people began to agree to use this name. In 1945, before the liberation of China, this is the last version of a Duanbing textbook. This, you can see, the one Duanbing, one xiangbing, how to make the swords, one longer, one shorter, and very similar to the ones we use. So with a stick inside, wrapped by leather, and at the tip, this is the cotton. It is just like a stick. So without having a protection, it can be hit badly. When I was young, I really hated it. It's only that we brought some such devices, and we brought it to Guangdong because of the humidity, because of the climate weather. The Duanbing were ruined. We are fortunate that we have developed some new Duanbing devices now. After the liberation, there were some involvements. In 1953, the first national sports game was held, and my uncle, elder uncle, and the second uncle, they participated in the competition, and the competition aroused a lot of discussions in China. So this tradition has been kept in China, in my family very well. In 1963, we have sports institutes, and people began to prepare their own textbooks. And the Duanbing was included into their new textbooks by taking reference of the game rules of the national sports game in 1953. My second uncle was one of the members in preparing such a textbook for Duanbing. My father, in the early 2000s, he began to make a new Duanbing in Guangzhou. In the early 2000 to 2009, we made some experiments in Guangzhou and Hong Kong, very good results. From 2009, we began to promote Duanbing, and recently it has been growing very fast. In 2016, I set up my institute and began to promote Duanbing massively. To some extent, I have inherited what my uncles and what my father did and my ancestors did. They all have passion on Duanbing, and so do I. We hope that we can continue with the experiment for this 100 years. It's a pity that there are still some weak areas, and we hope that we will keep improving. In the recent years, we organized over 7 national Duanbing competitions. We also organized over 20 training seminars. So far, all the game rules and all the skills are basically the same as what they were 100 years ago. We just followed the game rules as said for the national arts. We think it is important. This is a tradition, and once it was set up, unless you prove that it is not correct, otherwise you would have to follow it, because it is not about you yourself, it's not about you, your family, but rather it's about the times, it's about this sports, the sword play is about our culture. So it is very important personally and also for my family. This is a history, some milestones in my institute. From 2009, we began to promote some new ideas after making some adjustments to my institute. Mr. Zhao, we share the same mentor, and we began to understand more about the European histories. So 2 of my children, they went to Italy to learn fencing and sword play. For me personally, it's a big impact. I have never thought about such, it's a remaking of swords, and it's made of metal. It's so different from the Chinese weapons. In the past 5 to 10 years, we in the last 5 to 10 years, our life became better. That's why we were able to invest more money into it. Now we have the capital. We have opened our cooperations with the European countries. And personally, I will definitely go more for more exchanges with our European partners. So from my personal point of view, from my family point of view, or for the sake of promoting Duanbing program to other countries. In the past 2 years, we began to change the making of Duanbing. We began to use metal. We hope that in the near future, we can promote Duanbing to the world. And we can use our Duanbing technology, our techniques to compete with other martial arts fans. I am a martial fan. For 3 generations, my family has been working in this area for 150 years. So single-held sword or double-hand-held sword, I have one recognition from people in this circle, and we are the inheritors of such a sword culture. So talking about the spreading of Chinese martial arts in the world, very often I feel confused. I keep asking myself, is that our way of thinking is different from others? So why the spreaders of Chinese martial arts, Chinese or foreign people, why people talk about the differences all the time instead of the similarities? The Chinese knives are different from others. The Chinese swords are different. The Chinese techniques are different. The way Chinese people held swords are different, or even our scales are different. We talk about the differences too much. So when I was young, so I learned from my father about swords. For me, I haven't seen so many differences between China and other countries. Rather, I see a lot of similarities. So we practice martial arts in different time in different countries. We use the weapons, we use the devices for the sake of the same goal. So because you want to beat over your enemy, you defend for yourself, you win the competition. This is the common goal. So the differences between our countries, our martial arts, our devices are not that important. we are all human beings. We all have both hands. So personally, I think we must go closer and closer together to share the similarities instead of talking about the differences altogether all the time. Maybe some people wouldn't be happy hearing
Dear Hamar,
what
I
I
would
said
like
just
you
now.
to come to a conclusion, please. We are overrun. Can you? Thank you.
I hope that we should pay more attention to the similarities instead of the differences. And you're welcome to China, to Jiangong Shuyuan, to learn more about Duanbing. And you are all my friends. Thank you very much.